This is the last movie on macros, the last one of 3, and it's about references. We're going to look at macros that are recorded using absolute references, and then macros that are recorded using relative references, and then we're going to walk through an example of the application of using relative references. So I've got a worksheet set up with some data that we're going to manipulate and reorient into columns from the row configuration that it currently is in. But before we get to that, I want to talk about absolute and relative references. By default, macros are recorded using an absolute reference. And so what does that mean really? What does it look like? Well, we can see what it looks like by going to the VBA editor, pressing Alt F11. And if your screen isn't split screened like this, and you have Windows 7, grab the top of it and cross the threshold on the right side. And what I want to do is do the same thing to the Excel screen by crossing on the left side, so I have the 2 screens displayed side by side. And then I'm going to arrow over a bit because I want some space on the worksheet, and we're not going to deal with that data quite yet. So we're going to record a macro. And the project screen on your VBA editor may look a little different than mine. You may not have a personal macro workbook. If you don't, you'll just see whatever workbooks that you have open listed on the project screen. But among them should be our practice workbook, chapter 50. So I'm going to record a macro. I'm going to first select a cell. We'll select N10, and then left-click the View tab, left-click the Macros drop-down. Now, right below this button is a Use Relative Reference toggle switch. It is not on. By default, it is not on. And we're going to leave that off, which means we're going to record this macro using absolute references. When I left-click, I get the Record Macro dialog box. I'm going to call this macro absolute. You probably could have guessed that. I'm going to store it in this workbook and left-click OK, and I get a module added to the Chapter 50 workbook. Expanding that folder and double-clicking that module, I see that Excel has defined a subroutine called absolute, which is the name of our macro. It has a series of comments that begin with an apostrophe, and then it ends the subroutine by the end sub statement. Well, all we're going to do is put a fill into this cell by going to the Home tab and left-clicking any color that you like. Let's pick a dark one. And we're going to contrast a couple of things. First off, we look at the VBA code. It says with selection. And even though we're recording an absolute referenced macro, what we just did so far was actually record a macro with a relative reference. And the reason for that is because we selected our cell before we recorded the macro. If instead I was to select a cell, Excel records some VBA code with a reference to a range that is the cell I just selected, that's hard-coded, and then I put a fill on that cell. The rest of the code looks the same, but I actually have 2 different references here. I'm going to turn off the macro recorder, and I'm going to go down 1 cell and make N11 the active cell. Left-click the View tab, left-click the Macros drop-down, view my macros, let me get this dialog box out of the way, and run it. So what's happened? The first block of code says with selection. So that's actually a relative reference, even though we recorded the macro using the absolute reference default. If you select a cell before you record anything, the code that's written is a reference to that cell that says with selection, and that means with any cell that you have selected. With the second block of the code, we selected the cell after we started recording the macro. And the reference to that cell is hard-coded. It's a range reference to cell O10. So every time I run that macro, and I'll select a different cell again, left-click the drop-down, view macros, and get it out of the way a little bit, run it again, the selected cell gets the fill, and then the second block of code fills cell O10 with the same fill. Of course, you can't really see that because there was no change because it was already filled that color. So what does a relative macro look like? I'm going to go over and select cell Q10, left-click the macro drop-down, and left-click the Use Relative Reference toggle switch, and that will stay on until you turn it off. Left-click Record Macro, and this time I'm going to call this one, you guessed it, Relative. Left-clicking OK. Excel has set up my subroutine called Relative, closing it with the end sub statement with a comment that says Relative Macro. I'm now going to select a cell that's 3 cells below the current cell. And the reference that gets written into the code looks different than the other 2 references we've created so far. This reference is an offset to the active cell that was cell Q10, and it is 3 rows below and 0 columns over. Those 2 numbers, 3 and 0, row column, RC, is the way that code will be written every single time. A positive number for the row is going down, a negative number is going up. A positive number for the column reference, which is 0 currently, is going over to the right, and a negative number is going over to the left. We went down 3 cells and over 0, and that's what the reference says. So I'm going to fill that cell with the same color, and the rest of that code looks exactly like the other 2 blocks of code we just created. And then I'm going to stop recording. And so what does this look like when we activate it? You can probably guess. I'm going to make R10 the active cell, go to the View tab, left-click the Macros drop-down, left-click View Macros, and this time we're going to run the relative reference. And so when we recorded this macro, Q10 was the active cell, and we ended up applying the fill color to the cell that was 3 cells below the active cell. Well, now R10 is the active cell, so when you run the macro, the cell that is affected is 3 cells below the active cell. Now, the thing that can trip you up with absolute references is that that absolute reference that's in the second block of the first macro that we created that references cell O10 will always be cell O10. If I insert a column, that reference doesn't change. In fact, I'm going to insert 2 more columns, and I'm going to rerun that macro. Left-clicking the drop-down, View Macros, Absolute, Run. The active cell at the time I ran the macro is filled with the fill color. That's the first block of code. And the second block of code filled cell O10 once again, even though what was O10 when we recorded the macro is now R10. That fixed nature of absolute references can trip you up with macros. It's just something to keep in mind. So with that as a backdrop, we're going to go back to our data and manipulate our data. So back to our data. We have data that's oriented vertically that we want to reorient horizontally. And we have 5 records here, but this actually came from a list of about 6,000 records. So this is the thing that a macro is great for. And once you learn a bit more about VBA code, you'll find that you can set up a loop to have this macro run on as many records as necessary. So if I had all 6,000 records here, we could record the macro and then go in and write some VBA code to have it loop through all of the records on the worksheet and have it reorient 6,000 records fairly quickly. But first we need a macro. And I'm going to select the first field in the first record that we need to move. Go to the View tab, left-click the Macros drop-down, and the Use Relative References option is already selected. It's got a little yellow box around it. It's a little bit difficult to tell, but this is a toggle switch, and it'll stay on until you turn it off, and then it'll stay off until you turn it on. So we want it on. I'm going to left-click Record Macro, and I'm going to call this macro Data, and then hold down the Shift key and assign a shortcut key of Control-Shift-R for relative. I want it stored in this workbook. I'm going to left-click OK. So now we're recording our macro. I'm going to press Control-X, go to the destination, G7, and press Enter. Go back to the second field, Control-X, Enter. The third field, Control-X, Enter. The SIC code, Enter. The exchange, Enter. And then I'm going to select the first field of the next record. At this point, we have our macro recorded. I'm going to turn the recorder off. And now To move those records from a vertical orientation to a horizontal orientation, press Control-Shift-R, and since we finished our macro with it selecting the first field of the next record, all we have to do is press Control-Shift-R again, Control-Shift-R, Control-Shift-R. I'm going to page up. Now, I know we have some spaces in between our records, but that's easily solved by selecting the range, and since they were alphabetically listed in the first place, just go to Data and Sort. And once again, just as a reminder, anything you do with a macro, you can't use the Undo button to undo. I can undo the sort that I just applied, but that's it. I don't have any more undo options, so just keep that in mind. So that's absolute and relative references. We first opened up the VBA editor and aligned it next to our worksheet so that we could create a couple of macros, one using an absolute reference, which there's two ways to record using an absolute reference, either selecting the cell before you start recording or after. We found that using absolute references hard codes the reference into our code. Using a relative reference, there's a different code that's written where the macro is recorded with a reference that's oriented to the selected cell at the time you do the recording, so that when you run the macro, that same cell relative to the position of the active cell when you run the macro is the one that will be affected by the macro. And then we used a relative reference macro to reorient data from a vertical to a horizontal orientation.